Yeah, recording.
हाय गाइस, आज हम पढ़ रहे हैं द गिफ्ट बाय व्लादिमिर नाबोकोव। और ये ओरिजिनली रशियन में थी बुक, और ये ट्रांसलेट की गई है इंग्लिश में। बट मतलब अच्छी ट्रांसलेट की गई है, ऐसी कुछ प्रॉब्लम नहीं है। इसको हम कुछ टाइम से पढ़ रहे हैं। अभी है हम पेज 201 पे। बट इट्स ओके अगर आपने पहली स्ट्रीम्स नहीं देखी या पहली बुक नहीं पढ़ी है, बिकॉज इट इज़ नॉट अबाउट रीडिंग द होल थिंग टुगेदर, इट इज़ अबाउट इंजॉइंग जो भी हम छोटा सा पार्ट साथ में पढ़ेंगे। तो वी विल गिव यू कंटेक्स्ट कि अभी तक क्या हुआ है। तो अभी तक ज़्यादा कुछ हुआ नहीं है, क्योंकि इसमें ज़्यादा उतना प्लॉट नहीं है बुक में मतलब है प्लॉट, बट वो ये वैसी वाली बुक है जिसमें मतलब सुंदरता इज इन द इमेजेस एंड इन द प्रोज, एंड प्लॉट इज जस्ट लाइक आउट देयर थोड़ा सा। तो अभी तक हमारा जो प्रोटैगनिस्ट है उसका नाम है फ्योडोर। अम, वो एक रशियन राइटर है जो बर्लिन में रह रहा है 1920s में। और फ्योडोर तुमने बनाया नहीं, तुम जनरली फ्योडोर बनाते हो, वो बना दिया। तो उसने
Vladimir.
बर्लिन में रह रहा है 1920s में। उसने एक ऑलरेडी पोइट्री की बुक लिख दी है, बट उसको बहुत लोगों ने ख़रीदा नहीं है और ज़्यादा उसको कुछ फेम में मिला नहीं है। और वो अभी एक रेंट पे रहता है, एक मतलब हस्बैंड वाइफ और बेटी के साथ। और जो बेटी है उसके साथ उसका सीक्रेटली चक्कर चल रहा है। बेटी का नाम है जीना। तो और मतलब उसके जीना के मम्मी पापा को नहीं पता है कि वो रेंटर के साथ ही चक्कर चला रही है बेसिकली, एंड वो चाहती भी नहीं कि पता चले। um, तो लास्ट स्ट्रीम में जो हम पढ़ रहे थे वहाँ पे हम इस तक पहुँचे थे कि जीना और उसका चक्कर चल रहा था, एंड देन ऐसी कुछ बात हो रही थी कि फ्योडोर एक नई बुक लिखना चाहता है जो कि एक बायोग्राफी होगी निकोलाई चर्निशेव्स्की पे, हु इज़ अ रियल रशियन ऑथर, मतलब जो खुद में एक और रशियन ऑथर है। तो ये बात तब उस वहाँ पे चल रही थी कि ही वांट्स टू राइट अ बायोग्राफी ऑफ चर्निशेव्स्की। तो उसके आगे का मैंने थोड़ा सा पढ़ लिया था, तो उसने स्टार्ट कर दी थी वो बायोग्राफी लिखनी चेरनीशेव्स्की। हमें थोड़ी कंफ्यूजन भी थी लास्ट स्ट्रीम में, जो हम क्लियर कर सकते हैं कि वो किसी चेरनीशेव्स्की नाम के लोगों को भी जानता है जिनका बेटा था याशा, जो कि मर गया था। बट
Mm,
वो जो लोग हैं
mm,
उनका जस्ट नाम है चेरनीशेव्स्की, वो बाई चांस उनका नाम सेम है। बट एक्चुअली में वो
अच्छा,
चेरनीशेव्स्की ऑथर की बायोग्राफी लिखना चाहता है।
mm,
ठीक है। तो उसने लिखनी स्टार्ट कर दी थी, और मतलब उसने वो लाइब्रेरी गया, फिर उसने बहुत सारी बुक्स पढ़ी उसके बारे में, चेरनीशेव्स्की के बारे में, एक्सेट्रा एक्सेट्रा। और उसने लिखनी शुरू कर दिया। तो अब हम वहाँ से पढ़ेंगे। ठीक है। अम, ठीक है, आई विल रीड।
yes,
बाय
please.
ओके सीना। ठीक है। By winter, he had already got into the writing of it, having passed imperceptibly from accumulation to creation. Accumulation in the sense कि अभी वो सब कुछ उसके बारे में पढ़ रहा था, accumulate कर रहा था।
Research.
Research. Winter, like most memorable winters, and like all winters introduced for the sake of a narrational phrase, turned out, they always turn out in such cases, to be cold. ये लाइन मुझे पर्सनली बहुत अच्छी लगी। तो ये वाला वर्ड मैंने ऑलरेडी पढ़ रखा है, बट
Hmm,
फॉर से विंटर टर्न्ड आउट, दे ऑलवेज टर्न आउट टू बी कोल्ड, कि हम भी ऐसा
hmm,
बोलते हैं ना कि इस बार ठंड बहुत पड़ रही है, जबकि हर बार
hmm.
ही पड़ती है।
हाँ,
ठीक है। एट हिज इवनिंग ट्रिस्ट्स विद जीना, तो ये और जीना छुप छुप के मिलते हैं शाम में। एट हिज
hmm,
इवनिंग ट्रिस्ट्स विद जीना इन एन एम्प्टी लिटिल कैफे वेयर द काउंटर was painted an indigo color, and where dark blue gnome like lamps, miserably posing as vessels of coziness, glowed on 6 or 7 little tables. He read her what he had written during the day, and she listened, her painted lashes lowered, leaning on one elbow, playing with a glove or a cigarette case. Sometimes the proprietor's dog would come up, a fat mongrel bitch with low hanging bubs, and would place its head on Zina's knee. And beneath the stroking and smiling hand that smoothed back the skin on its silky round forehead, the dog's eyes would take on a Chinese slant. And when she was given a lump of sugar, she would take it waddle in a leisurely manner into a corner, roll up there, and very loudly start crunching. Wonderful, but I'm not sure you can say it like that in Russian, said Zina sometimes. And after an argument, he would correct the expression she had questioned. Chernyshevsky is the author जिसकी biography लिख रहे हैं.
Hmm.
Chernyshevsky, she called Chernish for short, and got so used to considering him as belonging to Fyodor and partly to her that his actual life in the past appeared to her as something of a plagiarism. Fyodor's idea of composing his biography in the shape of a ring, closed with the clasp of an apocryphal sonnet, so that the result would be not the form of a book, which by its finiteness is opposed to the circular nature of everything in existence, but a continuously curving and thus infinite sentence. So Fyodor's idea of composing his biography in the shape of a ring seemed at first to her to be incapable of embodiment on flat rectangular paper. And so much the more was she overjoyed when she noticed that nevertheless a circle was being formed. She was completely unconcerned whether or not the author clung assiduously to historical truth. She took that on trust, for if it were not thus, it would simply not have been worth writing the book. A deeper truth, on the other hand, for which he alone was responsible, and which he alone could find, was for her so important that the least clumsiness or fogginess in his words seemed to be the germ of a falsehood, which had to be immediately exterminated. Gifted with a most flexible memory, which twined like ivy around what she perceived, Zena, by repeating such word combinations as she particularly liked, ennobled them with her own secret convolution. And whenever Fyodor, for any reason, changed a turn of a phrase which she had remembered, the ruins of the portico stood for a long time on the golden horizon, reluctant to disappear. There was an extraordinary grace in her responsiveness, which imperceptibly served him as a regulator, if not as a guide. And sometimes, when at least three customers had gathered, an old lady pianist in pince nez would sit at the upright piano in the corner and play Offenbach's Barcarolle as a march. क्या कुछ कहना है इस
Yeah.
बारे में आगे पढ़ूं?
First of all, going back, ये
हम्म
plagiarism, Zena, I don't know who tells this, कि they feel कि they know Shenishevsky so much that his actual past seems
हम्म
plagiarized, ऐसा कुछ है, वो
हाँ,
समझ नहीं
ये
आया मुझे.
मुझे भी ये लाइन काफी अच्छी लगी है. जीना बोलती है चेरनिशेव्स्की she called Chernish for short and got
Hmm.
so used to considering him as belonging to Fyodor and partly to her that his actual life in the past appeared to her as something of a plagiarism.
Whose life, whose past, and why plagiarism?
चेरनिशेव्स्की की लाइफ कि चेरनिशेव्स्की को उसने इतना अपना सा मान लिया ये सब उसकी बायोग्राफी जो वो लिख रहा था पढ़ पढ़ के कि
Hmm.
जो उसकी एक्चुअल लाइफ है वो
Hmm.
उसको लगा मतलब कि जो फ्योडोर लिख रहा है वो उसको लगा कि वो ट्रूथ है और जो
Hmm.
एक्चुअल में उसकी लाइफ है वो प्लेजराइज करी है किसी ने.
अच्छा, ओके. वो टी शर्ट है ना तेरा,
क्या
रियलिटी रूइंस माय लाइफ.
यस बट ये काफी सही है मतलब ये जो इमेज उसके बैठ के सुनने की आई थिंक मुझे जीना वाला पार्ट इन जनरल इस नॉवल का मेरा फेवरेट पार्ट है.
Hmm.
ये भी अच्छा लगा कि उसको इतनी पसंद आ जाती थी उसकी कुछ कुछ वर्ड्स और फ्रेजेस कि जब भी वो कुछ चेंज कर देता था तो बहुत ही
Hmm.
उसको टफ होता था तोड़ना. When
Right.
she, for any reason, changed a turn of phrase which she had remembered, the ruins of the portico stood for a long time on the golden horizon, reluctant to disappear.
Hmm.
ठीक है.
जैसे
um,
मैं करता हूँ जब हम कुछ डिस्कस करते हैं स्टोरी में.
तुम तो करने नहीं देते हो तुम तो गुस्सा हो जाते हो. ये क्या कह दिया?
हम्म, वही, I also am like that her.
यू आर लाइक फ्योडोर एंड जीना एट द सेम टाइम. तुम
Yes.
एक ही साथ अपने साथ ही ऑर्जी कर सकते हो.
Mm.
ठीक है. He was already approaching the end of his work when Zena said it would not hurt him to relax, and therefore on Saturday they would go together to a fancy dress ball at the house of an artist friend of hers. Fyodor was a bad dancer, could not stand German bohemians, and moreover refused point blank to put fantasy in a uniform, which is what in effect masked balls do. Masked balls, mask जिसमें पहनते हैं. They compromised on his wearing a half mask and a dinner jacket that had been made about 4 years previously and not worn more than 4 times in the interim. And I'll go as a, she began dreamily, but cut herself short. Only not as a boyar maiden and not as Columbine, I beg you, said Fyodor. That would be just like me, said she scornfully. Oh, I assure you, it'll be terribly gay, she added tenderly, to dissipate his gloom. Why, after all, we'll be all alone in the crowd. I so want to go. We'll be the whole night together and no one will know who you are. And I've thought myself up a costume specially for you. He conscientiously imagined her with a naked tender back and pale bluish arms. But here all kinds of excited bestial faces slipped through illegally. The coarse trash of noisy German revels. Bad liquor inflamed his gullet. He belched from the chopped egg sandwiches, but he again concentrated his thoughts, revolving to the music on Zena's transparent temple vein. Of course it will be gay. Of course we'll go, he said with conviction. It was decided that she should set off at 9 and he would follow an hour later ताकि घर में किसी को doubt ना हो.
Mhm.
Cramped by the time limit, he did not sit down to work after supper but fiddled around with a new emigre magazine where Konchiev was twice mentioned fleetingly. Konchiev एक और writer है जिसको फ्योडोर अपना rival type का मानता
Mhm.
है.
Mhm.
New magazine where Conchev was twice mentioned fleetingly, and these casual references, which implied the poet's general recognition, were more valuable than even the most favorable review. Only 6 months ago, this would have provoked in him. तो जो पहले वाला ही है ये कॉन्चियव के लिए है कि ये सब कैजुअल रेफरेंसेस जो हैं वो ज़्यादा वैल्यूएबल
Mhm.
हैं.
Mhm.
And second वाला ही हमारे फ्योडोर के लिए है. Only 6 months ago, this would have provoked in Fyodor what Pushkin's envious Salieri felt, but now he himself was amazed by his own indifference to another's fame. पहले ये बहुत जेलस हुआ करता था कॉन्चियव के लिए कोई रिव्यू या कुछ आता था बट अब इसको
Mhm.
फर्क नहीं पड़ता.
जीना है ना.
हाँ अब तो बॉल में भी जाना है उसके साथ.
हम्म.
He looked at his watch and slowly began to change. He unearthed his drowsy looking dinner jacket and lapsed into thought. Still meditating, he took out a starched shirt, put his evasive collar studs in, climbed into it, shivering from its rigid chill. Again was motionless for a moment, then automatically pulled on his black trousers with a stripe, and remembering that he had made up his mind only that morning to cross out the last of the sentences he had written the previous day, he bent over the already heavily corrected page. As he read the sentence over, he wondered should he leave it intact after all? Made an insertion mark, wrote in an additional adjective, froze over it, and swiftly crossed out the whole sentence. But to leave the paragraph in that condition, that is, its construction hanging over a precipice with a boarded window and a crumbling porch, was a physical impossibility. He examined his notes for this part, and suddenly his pen stirred and started to fly. When he looked again at his watch, it was 3 in the morning. He had the chills, and everything in the room was dim from tobacco smoke. Simultaneously, he heard the click of the American lock. His door was ajar, and as she passed by it through the hall, Zena caught sight of him. pale, with mouth wide open, in an unbuttoned starched shirt, with suspenders trailing on the floor, pen in hand, and the half mask on his desk, showing black against the whiteness of paper.
Oh shit.
No. She locked herself in her room with a bang, and everything again grew quiet. That's a fine mess, said Fyodor in a low voice. What have I done? Thus, he never found out what dress Zina had gone in, but the book was finished. कितना वो है ये
Hmm.
बट ठीक है ये हमारा हार्टलेस फ्योडोर बट ये जो इमेज है आई थिंक
हार्ट वैसी नहीं है, फोकस्ड है।
बट एंड में भी तो कैसे हार्टलेसली बोलता है दैट्स अ फाइन मेस व्हाट हैव आई डन
हाँ हाँ, मतलब he is detached from everything, although he enjoys everything. वैसे ही रहना है।
वैसे ही रहना है सही बात है इमेज
हम्म,
बहुत अच्छी लगी है मुझे बट मतलब वन ऑफ माय फेवरेट इमेजेस ऑफ द बुक वन ऑफ माय मतलब फेवरेट टेस्ट तो नहीं बट इट विल सर्टेनली गो इन द लिस्ट
कौन सा?
यही वाला जब वो उसको देखती है और वो ऐसे खड़ा होता है और उसका ब्लैक मास्क होता है साइड में
हम्म,
रखा हुआ
हम्म,
ठीक है A month later, on a Monday, he took the fair copy to Vasiliev. Vasiliev इसका editor है,
हम्म,
who, as early as last autumn, knowing of his investigations, had half offered to have the Life of Chernyshevsky, जो book लिए लिख रहा है, published by the house attached to the Gazeta. The following Wednesday, Fyodor was again there, chatting quietly with old Stupishchin. Stupishchin उसके ऑफिस में शायद कोई काम करता है ऐसे पहले तो कोई रेफरेंस नहीं हुआ है Stupishchin का who
ओके।
used to wear bedroom slippers at the office. Suddenly, the study door opened and filled with the bulk of Vasiliev, who looked blackly at Fyodor for a moment and then said impassively, be so good as to come in, and moved to one side for him to slip through. Well, have you read it? Asked Fyodor as he took a seat across the table. I have, replied Vasiliev in a gloomy bass. Personally, said Fyodor briskly, I would like it to come out this spring. Here's your manuscript, said Vasiliev suddenly, knitting his brows and handing him the folder. Take it. There can be no question of my being part to its publication. I assumed that this was a serious work, and it turns out to be a reckless, antisocial, mischievous improvisation. I am amazed at you. Well, that's nonsense, said Fyodor. No, my dear sir, it's not nonsense, roared Vasiliev, irately fingering the objects on his desk, rolling a rubber stamp, changing the positions of meek books for review, conjoined accidentally with no hopes for permanent happiness. No, my dear sir, there are certain traditions of Russian public life which the honorable writer does not dare to subject to ridicule. I am absolutely indifferent to whether you have talent or not. I only know that to lampoon a man whose works and suffering have given sustenance to millions of Russian intellectuals is unworthy of any talent. I know that you won't listen to me, but nevertheless, and Vasiliev, grimacing with pain, clutched at his heart. I beg you, as a friend, not to try to publish this thing. You will wreck your literary career, mark my words. Everyone will turn away from you. I
काफी
prefer the
बोल।
back I prefer the back of their heads, said Fyodor.
हम्म,
ठीक है तो इसने कुछ यही ऐसा ही कुछ ये कह रहा है ना कि जो चेरनीशेव्स्की है वो बड़ा रशियन ऑथर है उसको तुमने रिडिक्यूल टाइप का कर दिया थोड़ा सा अपने बायोग्राफी में तो ये नहीं कर सकते तुम
हम्म,
दैट नाइट ही वॉज इन्वाइटेड टू द चेरनीशेव्स्कीज तो ये जो चेरनीशेव्स्कीज हैं ये इसके दोस्त हैं उनका नाम भी सरनेम भी चेरनीशेव्स्की है बाई चांस की बात है उनका ऑथर चेरनीशेव्स्की से कोई रिलेशन नहीं है
हम्म,
That night he was invited to the Chernyshevskys, but Alexandra Yakovlevna, ये उसकी बीवी है Chernyshevsky की, put him
हम्म,
off at the last minute. Her husband was down with flu and ran a high temperature. Zina had gone to the cinema with someone so that he only met her the next evening. Kaput on the first try, as your stepfather would put it, he said in reply to her question about the manuscript. and briefly recounted his conversation at the editorial office. Indignation, tenderness towards him, the urge to help him immediately found expression with her in a burst of enterprising energy. Oh, that's how it is, she exclaimed. All right, I'll get the money for publication. That's what I'll do. For the baby, a meal, for the father, a coffin, he said, transposing the words in a line of Nekrasov's poem about the heroic wife who sells her body to get her husband his supper. For the baby, a meal, for the father, a coffin. And another time, she would have taken offense at this bold joke. ठीक है चलो कोशिश तो कर रही है बेचारी शी बोरोड इसमें तो ईगो है ही बहुत बट इट्स ओके
ये कौन याशा है?
नहीं नहीं कौन है आशा
ये अभी कौन बोल रहा है कि मैं पैसे दे दूंगा?
जीना बोल रही है जीना
अच्छा, जीना बोल रही है। आई
हम्म
थॉट ही वेंट टू वो शनि
जैन
शेस्के का घर और उस वहाँ पे उसके बेटी बोल रही है।
नहीं
वो
नहीं
अभी
चेनी
तक
चिप्स के ने उस पे कैंसिल कर दिया और फिर जीना
हाँ,
हैड गॉन टू द सिनेमा विद समन सो दैट ही ओनली मेट हर द नेक्स्ट इवनिंग
हाँ।
ऐसा ठीक है तो जीना बोल रही है मैं दे दूंगा एंड ही इज लाइक कि हाँ अब यही रह गया कि वाइफ मेरी हीरोइक होके मुझे बचाएगी इससे तो मैं
हुँ,
मर ही जाऊँ
हुँ,
ठीक है She borrowed somewhere 150 marks and added 70 of her own, which she had put away for winter. But this sum was insufficient, and Fyodor decided to write to Uncle Oleg in America. Uncle Oleg का पहले वाले एक दो चैप्टर में रेफरेंस है उसके कोई फैमिली के अंकल हैं.
हुँ, हुँ,
Decided to write to Uncle Oleg in America, who regularly helped his mother and who also used occasionally to send a few dollars to him. The composition of this letter was put off from day to day, however, just as he put off, in spite of Zina's exhortations, an attempt to get his book printed serially by an Amiga literary magazine in Paris, or to interest the publishing house there, which had brought out Konchiev's verses. Konchiev इस एक और राइटर है जिसको ये अपना राइवल मानता है तो जीना उसको बोलती रही कि सीरियली करा लो कोंचियव की जिसने पब्लिश करी उनसे करा लो बट वो पुट ऑफ करे जरा था
हुँ,
uh, in her free time, she undertook to type the manuscript in the office. In her free time, Zena undertook to type the manuscript in the office of a relation of hers, and from him she collected another 50 marks. She was angered by Fyodor's inertia, a consequence of his hatred for any practical affairs. He, in the meantime, occupied himself light-heartedly with composing chess problems, dreamily went about his lessons, and rang up M.M.E. Chernyshevsky daily, जो
हुँ,
चेरनिशेव्स्की की बीवी है अलेक्जेंडर
हुँ,
याकोलेविच फ्लू जो बंदा है ये दो नाम यूज करते हैं सेम ही लोगों के लिए ये अलेक्जेंडर याकोलेविच और चेरनिशेव्स्की एक ही बंदा है अलेक्जेंडर
ओके।
याकोलेविच
दिस
फ्लू
इज़ द राइटर या फ्रेंड?
फ्रेंड फ्रेंड राइटर से तो इनका कोई कनेक्शन ही नहीं है राइटर तो
ओके।
अपना अलग ही है
हुँ,
Alexander Yakovlevich's flu had changed into an acute inflammation of the kidneys. One day in ठीक है वन डे ये खत्म हो गई है बात एकदम ही अलग चीज अब स्टार्ट हो गई है कि वो तो बीमार है वन डे इन द रशियन बुक शॉप ही फ्योडोर noticed a tall portly gentleman with a large featured face wearing a black felt hat a strand of chestnut hair falling from under it, who glanced at Fyodor affably and even with a kind of encouragement. Where have I met him? Thought Fyodor quickly, trying not to look. The other approached and offered his hand, generously, naively, defenselessly, spreading it wide, spoke, and Fyodor remembered. It was Bush, who 2.5 years ago had read his play at that literary circle. तो
हुँ,
आई ऑल्सो डोंट रिमेम्बर इस चीज़ का कुछ मेंशन था कि नहीं बट आई डोंट थिंक एक ही बार होगा अगर मेंशन होगा भी कि पहले कहीं जहाँ पे ये लिटरेरी सर्कल में रीड करी थी इसने शायद अपनी पोएम्स वहाँ पे इस बंदे ने भी रीड किया था बट इस बंदे का एज सच और कोई मेंशन तो नहीं है
हुँ,
तो इट वॉज बुश हु 2.5 years ago had read his play at that literary circle. Recently, he had published it, and now, pushing Fyodor with his hip, nudging him with his elbow, an infantine smile trembling on his noble, always slightly sweaty face. He produced a wallet. From the wallet, an envelope, and from the envelope, a clipping. A pitiful little review which had appeared in the Reigen emigre newspaper. Now, he said with awesome weightiness, this thing is also coming out in German. Moreover, I am now working on a novel. Fyodor tried to get away from him, but the latter left the shop with him and suggested they should go together. And since Fyodor was on his way to a lesson, I think ये lesson वाली बात दूसरी बार हो गई ये French sorry Russian lessons देता है बच्चों को. And
Yes.
since Fyodor was on his way to a lesson and thus was tied to a definite route, all he could do to try and save himself from Bush was to quicken his step. But this so speeded up his companion's speech that he slowed down again in horror. ये तो मेरे बात ही चल.
Hmm.
Uh, My novel, said Bush, looking into the distance and stretching aside his hand with a rattling cuff protruding from the sleeve of his black overcoat in order to stop Fyodor Konstantinovich. My novel is the tragedy of a philosopher who has discovered the absolute formula. He starts speaking and speaks thus. Bush, like a conjurer, plucked a notebook out of the air and began to read on the move. One has to one has to be a complete ass not to deduct from the fact of the atom the fact that the universe itself is merely an atom, or it would be truer to say some kind of trillionth of an atom. This was realized with his intuition already by that genius Blaise Pascal. But let us proceed, Louisa. At the sound of this name, Fyodor started and clearly heard the sounds of the German Grenadier March. Farewell, Louisa, wipe your eyes and don't cry. Not every bullet kills a good guy. And this subsequently continued to sound as if passing under the window of Bush's subsequent words. Exert, my dear, your attention. First, let me give a fanciful example. Let us assume that a certain physicist has managed to track down, out of the absolute unthinkable sum of atoms out of which the all is composited, that fatal atom with which our reasoning is concerned. We are supposing that he has brought his splitting down to the least essence of that very atom, at which moment the shadow of a hand falls on our universe with catastrophic results because the universe is but the final fraction of one, I think, central atom of those it consists of. It's not easy to understand, but if you understand this, you will understand everything. Out of the prison of mathematics, the whole is equal to the smallest part of the whole. The sum of the parts is equal to one part of the sum. This is the secret of the world, the formula of absolute infinity. But having made such a discovery, the human personality can no longer go on walking and talking. Shut your mouth, Louisa. Hmm. That's him talking to a cutie, his lady friend, added Bush with good natured indulgence, shrugging one mighty shoulder. ये मैं इस बस जस्ट ये पार्ट कहना चाहूँगी। ये एक
Hmm.
मुझे बहुत ही सही लगा जो इसने बीच में किया ना कि जब वो अपनी कहानी सुना रहा होता है बुश और वो बोलता है बट लेट
Hmm.
अस प्रोसीड लुइसा, तो उस टाइम पे फ्योडोर को लुइसा वाला गाना सुनाई देने लगता है। At the sound of this name, Fyodor started clearly heard the sounds of German Grenadier March. Farewell, Louisa. And
Hmm.
this subsequently continued to sound as if passing under the window of Bush's subsequent words. ये कितनी अच्छी इमेज है कि वो बुश अपना कुछ
Hmm.
बता रहा है और उसको पीछे से ये सब गाने सुनाई दे रहे हैं क्योंकि वो सुनना तो चाहता नहीं है.
Hmm.
ठीक है. Uh, Bush says, if you're interested, I can read it for you. I can read it to you from the beginning sometime, Bush continued. The theme is colossal. And you, may I ask, what are you doing? I, said Fyodor with a slight smile. I have also written a book about the critic Chernyshevsky. Only I can't find a publisher for it. The Chernyshevsky author तो था ही पर critic भी था. I think इसलिए
Hmm.
critic बोल रहे हैं. Ah, the popularizer of German materialism, of Hegel's reducers, the Grobianistic philosophers. एक तो इतने tough words नहीं use करने हैं, कुछ क्या बोल रहा है ये. Very honorable. I am more and more convinced that my publisher will take your work with pleasure. He is a comic personality, and for him, literature is a closed book. But I have the position of advisor to him, and he will hear me out. Give me your telephone number. I'll be seeing him tomorrow. And if he agrees in principle, then I'll skim through your manuscript, and I dare to hope that I'll recommend it in the most flattering manner. अब बढ़िया हो गया फ्योडोर को तो ऑफर मिल गया.
Hmm.
What rot, thought Fyodor. कैसे
What
हाथी चाहता
rod?
था. What rot,
Rot.
ROT.
Hmm.
What rot, thought Fyodor, and therefore was extremely surprised when the next day the kind soul did in fact ring him. The publisher turned out to be a plumpish man with a sad nose, reminding him somewhat of Alexander Yakovlevich, with the same red ears and a stipple of black hairs along each side of his polished bald pate. His list of published books was small but remarkably eclectic. Translations of German psychoanalytic novels done by an uncle of Bush's, The Poisoner by Adelaida Svetozarov, a collection of funny stories, an anonymous poem entitled I. But among this trash, there were two or three genuine books, such as, for example, the wonderful Stairway to the Clouds by Herman Lande, and also his Metamorphosis of Thought. Bush reacted to the life of Chernyshevsky, जो फ्योडोर ने लिखी है, as,
Hmm.
as to a good slap at Marxism, to the delivery of which Fyodor had not given the least thought when writing his work. And at the second meeting, the publisher, evidently the nicest of men, promised to publish the book by Easter, that is, in a month's time. He gave no advance and offered 5% on the first 1,000 copies, but on the other hand, he raised the author's percentage to 30% on the second 1,000 copies, which seemed to Fyodor both just and generous. However, he was completely indifferent to this side of the business and to the fact that the sales of emigre writers seldom reached 500 copies. Other emotions overwhelmed him. Other emotions overwhelmed him. Having shaken the moist hand of Radiant Bush, he emerged onto the street like a ballerina flying out onto the fluorescent stage. The drizzle seemed a dazzling dew. Happiness stood in his throat. Rainbow nimby trembled around the street lamps, and the book he had written talked to him at the top of its voice, accompanying him the whole time like a torrent on the other side of a wall. He headed for the office where Zena worked. Opposite that black building with benevolent looking windows inclined towards him, he found the pub where they were to meet. Well, what news? She asked, entering quickly. No, he won't take it, said Fyodor, watching with delighted attention, her face cloud as he toyed with his power over it and anticipated the exquisite light he was about to summon. That's it.
बस.
Done. Chapter 3 is over with a
Oh.
lovely last paragraph.
Hmm.
ये भी मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा कि द बुक ही हैड रिटन टॉक टू हिम एट द टॉप ऑफ इट्स वॉइस. ये पब्लिश हो गई तो बुक एकदम उसके सर में आ रही है कि हाँ.
हम्म. आपको एक्सपीरियंस हुआ है ये?
हाँ थोड़ा बहुत आई थिंक नॉट सो मच बिकॉज मैं इनिशियली तो खुश नहीं थी बट आई कैन
हम्म.
अंडरस्टैंड.
हम्म.
ये तो जीना वाला तो अच्छा ही था ऑफ कोर्स. लास्ट लाइन तो है ही बहुत अच्छी. नो ही वोंट टेक इट सेड फ्योडोर वाचिंग विद डिलाइटेड अटेंशन हर फेस क्लाउड as he toyed with his power over it and anticipated the exquisite light he was about to summon.
हम्म.
दो तीन लाइन में ही बहुत बढ़िया लिख देता है ये. ठीक है, कुछ तो हम वर्ड मीनिंग्स देखें. ये चैप्टर 3 ख़त्म हो गया इसका. चैप्टर 4 इज़ द एंटायर बुक जो उसने लिख दिया है, तो वो हम स्किप कर देंगे. वो मैं अलग से पढ़ लूँगी. वो तो पब्लिश हुआ भी नहीं था एक्चुअली ओरिजिनल पब्लिशिंग में. वर्ड मीनिंग्स वो तो मुझे देखने भी नहीं. वो जो बुश जो वर्ड्स यूज़ करता है हेगल्स ट्राड्यूसर्स द ग्रोबियोनास्टिक फिलोसफर्स, क्योंकि मुझे पता है मैं देख भी लूंगी तो भी याद नहीं रहेगा मुझे। एक तो मुझे देखना है इम्पैसिवली। इम्पैसिवली आई थिंक उसका मीनिंग होता है कि मतलब विदाउट एनी इमोशन, बट आई जस्ट वांट टू कंफर्म।
इम्प्रेसिवली मुझे लग रहा है कि स्टक टाइप। अच्छा, ओके,
देखो,
नॉट, डजंट मेक सेंस।
हाँ, नो इमोशन ना।
हम्म।
ठीक है, तो वैसिलियव उसको बोलता है जब उसको वो ऑफिस में बुलाता है। ही लुक्ड एट फ्योडोर फॉर अ मोमेंट देन सेड इम्पैसिवली, बी सो गुड एज टू कम इन। ठीक है, और क्या देखना है? असिडुअसली भी देखना था मुझे। असिडुअसली आई थिंक मतलब अच्छे से टाइप का होता है, बट आई डोंट नो। ASSIDUOUSLY। असिडुअसली विद ग्रेट, क्या है? अच्छा, विद ग्रेट
केयर
केयर
एंड
एंड।
परसिवरेंस।
अच्छा। तो ये जीना के, जब जीना उसकी बुक सुन रही होती है तब वो बोलती है कि शी वॉज completely unconcerned whether or not the author clung assiduously to historical truth. She took that on trust.
हम्म।
Yeah. फिर मुझे देखना था ennobled. आई थिंक एनो सजा देना होना चाहिए इसका मीनिंग फ्रॉम कंटेक्स्ट।
ENO या ANO?
ENNO।
BLED?
हाँ, यही। अच्छा,
Give
गिव
some
सम।
second, I think. Lend greater dignity or nobility of character to.
हम्म तो ये
Sen-
जीना ही बोलती है कि जीना को जो उसके कुछ कुछ वर्ड कॉम्बिनेशंस पसंद आ जाते हैं।
हम्म।
जीना बाय रिपीटिंग सच वर्ड कॉम्बिनेशंस एज शी पर्टिकुलरली लाइक्ड ennobled them with her own secret convolution।
हम्म।
तो उनको वो लैंड ग्रेटर डिग्निटी कर देती है। ओके, और एक मेरे को देखना था कॉन्शियंटियसली। इसका मैं शायद प्रोनाउंसिएशन भी सही नहीं कर रही हूँ। आई थिंक इसका
With
मतलब
क्या बोलते हैं?
हम्म, क्या?
With utmost sincerity type.
हाँ, यस,
हम्म।
यही होता है ना।
Presence of mind, वो सब
देखो एक
basically.
प्रोनाउंसिएशन भी देख बताना उसकी।
A, no?
कॉन्शियंटस। कॉन्शियंटसली।
Responsible, thorough way.
दैट इज वन स्मॉल सेंस ऑफ राइट। अच्छा, मॉरल और रिस्पॉन्सिबल।
हम्म।
कॉन्शियंटसली
हम्म।
थॉरो एंड रिस्पॉन्सिबल। अच्छा, प्रोनाउंसिएशन सुनाओ एक बार इसकी। स्पीकर पे क्लिक करो।
सुनाई दिया?
नहीं,
No.
देखो मैं अपने आप से देख लूँ क्या, मुझे तो नहीं सुनाई दिया।
तेलुगु में एक मूवी आई थी,
Conscientiously,
कॉन्शियंशियसली।
conscientiously,
कॉन्शियंशियसली।
conscientiously.
कॉन्शियंशियसली। बहुत ही बेकार। ठीक है, तो इन कॉन्टेक्स्ट वो ये जब वो बॉल वाली बात कर रहे होते हैं कि बॉल में ये ड्रेस पहन के जाऊंगी, वो ड्रेस पहन के जाऊंगी, तब वो बोलता है ही कॉन्शियसली इमेजिन्ड हर विद अ नेकेड टेंडर बैक एंड पेल ब्लूइश आर्म्स। तो रिस्पॉन्सिबली इमेजिन कर रहा था वो शर्ट, हरक से इमेजिन नहीं कर रहा था।
शिद्दत से।
शिद्दत से कर रहा था। वो भी देखना था मुझे। पिंस नेज भी देखना था। इसका मीनिंग मैं पहले देख चुकी हूँ बट मैं भूल जाती हूँ। लोगों ने हमेशा पिंस नेज पहना हुआ होता है कुछ तो ड्रेस।
स्पेलिंग?
PINCE-NEZ। पुरानी नॉवेल्स में हमेशा ही कुछ तो लोगों ने पहना होता है। हाँ, फर्स्ट वाला। हम्म
glasses
ओह,
with a no slip instead of.
हम्म
अच्छा।
इसका इमेज दिखाना, इमेजेस में जाना, इमेज में शायद दिख जाएगा। ये ना,
हाँ।
गॉट इट। तो ये पियानिस्ट ने पहना होता है। एन ओल्ड लेडी पियानिस्ट इन पिंस नेल्स would sit at the piano and play something. ठीक है.
मुझे देखना है
Precipice वो एक हाँ ये यस यही.
a steep rock face or cliff, especially a tall one. Oh, okay.
Edge of the precipice.
If people remember, मनरत्नम रावण का ओपनिंग है वो.
On a steep precipice stood Abhishek Bachchan. ऐसा है क्या?
हाँ, हिंदी वर्जन में तो अभिषेक बच्चन ही होना है.
Oh. Conscientiously करेंगे हम ये पॉडकास्ट.
Yes.
ठीक है, तो आज के लिए इतना काफी है. फिर हम आगे पढ़ेंगे.
Get down from precipice of our podcast.
प्रेसिपिस क्यों है हमारा पॉडकास्ट? एक हिल के कॉर्नर पे है हम कि हम गिरने वाले हैं. फेम हो सकता है, प्रेसिपिस ऑफ फेम, क्योंकि तुम उससे फेम 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 को प्रेसिपिस बोल सकते हैं ना, क्योंकि उससे आप गिर सकते हो.
Okay.
ठीक है.
I'm ending the recording.
Bye guys.
Bye.